My son shouted in my face, accept my wife as a joint venture partner, or you're no longer my father. Every eye at the dinner table turned toward me. The five-star restaurant suddenly fell silent. The clinking of silverware vanished completely. Major company partners looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. Henry stood there, his face flushed with alcohol and arrogance. The joint venture agreement was pushed across the table toward me. Beside him sat Autumn Riley, her knees tucked together beneath an elegant evening gown. She wore a faint smile. It was the smile of a hunter who believed the trap had finally closed around its prey. She thought I was old. She thought I would give in just to preserve what little dignity I had left. Henry slammed his hand onto the table. He called me outdated. He said I was standing in the way of the younger generation's progress. He had forgotten who built this company from a pile of rubble. The very first blueprint of this business was drawn on the hood of my old pickup truck. I looked straight into my son's eyes. This betrayal hurt more than any injury I had suffered on a construction site. The foundation I had spent 20 years building had apparently raised an ungrateful son. I didn't sign. Slowly I fastened the button of my suit jacket. I looked at Autumn. For a brief moment anger flashed behind her expensive makeup. Then I turned and walked away. The sound of my dress shoes striking the marble floor echoed with cold precision. I left the restaurant. The night wind hit my face like ice. But my heart felt colder. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. My name is Paul, and this is how I taught them the most expensive lesson of their lives. Stay until the end and leave a comment with the city you're watching from, so I can know how far this story has reached. I stood beneath the streetlights. Inside, the feast of vultures was still underway. They thought they had won. They thought they had pushed the master builder out of his own project. But Henry and Autumn didn't know one thing. No matter how magnificent a building may appear, it will collapse if its foundation is hollowed out from within, and I was the one holding the original blueprint of that foundation. The game had only just begun. I drove through the late night. The clock on the dashboard showed 4 in the morning. I pushed open the office door. The place was dark and silent. The air carried the scent of old files and unfinished wood. I didn't turn on the lights. The faint glow from the street lamps outside filtered through the large glass windows, casting long, uneven shadows across the floor. I lowered myself into the familiar leather chair. A dull ache flared in my knee joint. Changing weather always reminded me of the years I had spent working on construction sites. Henry had forgotten that today's luxury parties were built on my calloused hands and 18-hour workdays. He looked at this 15-story building and thought it had risen from the ground by itself. He looked at the millions of dollars in assets and assumed they had always existed. He didn't know the smell of sweat mixed into every bucket of scorching mortar beneath the summer sun. He didn't know about the winter nights that cut through bone. He didn't know that I had stood on wind-whipped scaffolding inspecting every weld with my own eyes. I ran my fingers across the wooden desk. In one corner, a deep scratch was still visible where a steel ruler had gouged the surface years ago. The memory of 20 years earlier came rushing back and tightened my chest. Back then I owned nothing but an old pickup truck and a rusted toolbox. My greatest asset was Sarah, my late wife. She was the woman who had shared cheap boxed meals with me beside construction trailers. She stayed awake with me through sleepless nights while I revised every line on every blueprint. Sarah always told me that as long as the foundation was strong, any storm could be endured. When Henry was born, I swore I would give him the best life possible. I built this company with everything I had to create a launching pad for his future. But now, Sarah was gone. The building still stood strong, yet people's hearts had rotted away. The little boy I once carried in my arms was now offering his mother's life's work to another woman. A woman who had been in his life for less than 6 months. He was willing to throw his own father aside just to earn her smile. The sacrifices Sarah and I made had somehow become the very weapon he used to stab me in the heart. The pain in my chest slowly transformed into something far colder. I opened the desk drawer. Beneath a stack of old project files sat a black backup phone. I powered it on and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. The person on the other end answered after 3 rings. "I need to know exactly who that woman Autumn really is," I said. "I need to know what kind of poison has turned my son into a stranger." And the answer from the private investigator on the other end of the line left me completely stunned. I hung up the phone. Silence returned and wrapped itself around the room. My head buzzed. The seeds of doubt Autumn had been planting over the past 6 months had finally taken shape. I remembered the day she first entered Henry's life. She arrived like a gentle autumn breeze, graceful and refined. She dressed modestly. She always spoke sweetly about the future and dedication. Henry was completely captivated by that perfect exterior. My poor son believed he had found the love of his life. But I had noticed something was wrong from the smallest details. It was the greedy look in her eyes whenever they drifted across the expensive art pieces in my home. It was the way she skillfully questioned Henry about control of major projects. Autumn began isolating Henry from me. She used indirect but poisonous remarks to manipulate his thinking. Through conversations with loyal employees, I learned that she whispered into Henry's ear night after night. She told him that his father was outdated. She told him that Paul's management methods no longer fit the modern world. The company needed fresh blood to break through its limitations. And according to her, that fresh blood was Autumn herself. Henry gradually changed. He started looking at me with suspicion. Discussions about construction engineering turned into heated arguments. He believed I was holding back his creativity. He never understood that my strict standards existed to protect the company from catastrophic cracks. Autumn had been remarkably successful in turning me into a stubborn, controlling old man in my son's eyes. She played the role of the patient, supportive wife. She always sided with Henry while quietly feeding his pride. Her objective had been achieved tonight. Henry had destroyed the bond between father and son with his own hands in order to protect her. He thought he was being a hero. He thought he was protecting his love and his future. The manipulation was terrifying. Autumn never needed violence. All she needed were poisonous whispers to bring down an empire from within. She had turned my son into a pawn on her chessboard. But Autumn had made one very serious mistake. She believed I was nothing more than a helpless old man clinging to the past. She didn't know that a master builder always tests concrete before pouring a foundation. I walked to the window and looked down at the sprawling city streets below. The first light of dawn was beginning to appear on the horizon. I knew I had to act before it was too late. I needed undeniable proof to tear away this woman's mask. I picked up the phone and called Margaret, my most trusted assistant. I instructed her to gather every piece of personal information she could find on Autumn. And what Margaret sent me at noon that very day was beyond anything I could have imagined. The tablet screen glowed in the dim office. Margaret stood beside me. Her face was tense. The digital file was open. Page after page of documents appeared on the screen, filled with numbers, photographs, and confidential stamps. What I was looking at was not the background of a successful woman. It was the profile of a professional predator. Her real name was Autumn Riley. But her life was nothing like the gentle image her name suggested. Her 3 previous husbands had all been mid-sized construction contractors in different states. The one thing they had in common was that they all went bankrupt under mysterious circumstances after marrying her. At present, Autumn was carrying more than $300,000 in personal gambling debt owed to major casinos. Creditors were actively searching for her. She didn't just want the company, she needed a lifeline to stay afloat. And she had chosen my son as the sacrifice. I leaned back in my chair. A wave of disgust tightened my chest. My foolish son believed he had found a queen. He had no idea he was bringing a venomous snake into his home. Autumn had studied my family carefully. She knew Henry was my greatest weakness. She used beauty and sweetness to conceal a rotten soul. She wanted to swallow the company I had built with blood and sweat. She wanted to use our money to fill the endless pit of her debts. Margaret looked at me with concern. She asked whether we should show the file to Henry immediately. I shook my head. I knew my son. Right now, blind love had clouded his judgment. If I presented this evidence, he would assume I had fabricated everything to smear his wife. He would defend her even more fiercely. The pride of a grown man who believed he was finally proving himself would push him to fight me to the very end. I couldn't use force. Autumn's mask had already fallen in front of me, but I needed it to fall in front of everyone. Most of all in front of Henry. I needed a new blueprint. A blueprint for a perfect trap. I closed the tablet and looked at Margaret. Then I made a bold decision. I would pretend to lose. I would hand over the CEO's chair to Henry exactly as he wanted. I rose from my seat and picked up my coat. There were 2 important people I needed to meet immediately. They were the people who would help me lay the very first brick in my plan for revenge. I walked into a small coffee shop hidden behind the materials warehouse. It was a world away from the upscale restaurants Henry preferred. At our usual corner table, Jake and Maria were already waiting for me. They had been my concrete and steel suppliers for years. They were people who had stood beside me since the days when the company operated out of a cramped rented office. The moment they saw me, they rose to their feet. Their eyes revealed the anger they felt on my behalf after hearing the rumors about last night's dinner. I sat down and motioned for them to stay calm. I didn't complain. I didn't ask for sympathy. Instead, I slid 2 new contracts across the table. They were the incorporation documents for a new company called Davis Construction Solutions. I looked directly at my 2 old friends. I told them I needed them to transfer all preferred material supply terms to this new entity. I also needed them to discontinue the deferred payment arrangements they had extended to Henry's company. Jake slammed his hand onto the table. He said he worked with Paul Davis because of trust, not because of the name on some corporate sign. Maria nodded in agreement. She said that without my personal guarantee, she wouldn't deliver a single brick to Henry. A faint smile crossed my face. Exactly. Relationships could not be transferred through contracts. My reputation belonged to the name Paul Davis, not to the sign hanging on that building. Henry believed that keeping the CEO's seal meant keeping everything. He was far too naive. Over the next 2 days, I quietly contacted my most loyal clients. They were the major developers behind the company's most important projects. I gave them a brief explanation regarding the leadership changes at the old company. I never spoke badly about my son. I simply withdrew all of my personal technical guarantees as chief engineer. The major partners immediately understood the implications. They knew Henry was a man of theories. Their trust had always rested in my experienced hands, not in the promises of a man still trying to prove himself. The blueprint for my revenge was complete. Every move had been measured down to the millimeter. I had removed the strongest structural elements from the old company and transferred them into my new house. The only thing I left behind for Henry and Autumn was a beautiful exterior shell with nothing of substance inside. Just then, my phone vibrated. It was a call from the court clerk. The official summons regarding the transfer of authority had been issued. I smiled and began preparing my finest suit. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted, but it would also mark the beginning of a nightmare from which they would never fully awaken. The main conference room of the old company was flooded with sunlight. Henry sat at the head of the table. His face carried the smug expression of a man who believed victory was already his. Autumn sat beside him. She wore an expensive business suit, and the hunger in her eyes was impossible to hide whenever she looked at the CEO's chair. I entered the room calmly. I placed my leather briefcase on the table and took a seat across from them. There was no warm greeting between father and son, only the cold formality of a business transaction. Henry's attorney slid the transfer documents toward me. The agreement would officially strip me of my executive authority. It would transfer full control and 50% ownership to Autumn exactly as Henry had demanded. I picked up the pen. I looked directly into Autumn's eyes. A flash of triumph sparkled there. She thought she had fooled an old man. She thought she was only moments away from controlling a multi-million-dollar fortune that would erase her debts. I signed my name with a steady hand. But before returning the documents, I turned to the final page. I pointed to an additional clause printed in very small lettering. It was a provision concerning joint financial liability for the company's existing loans and obligations. I looked at Autumn and explained that if she wanted to receive those shares, she would have to sign as a personal guarantor for all outstanding corporate debt. Henry immediately came to his wife's defense. He said that was perfectly reasonable because Autumn was now family. He wanted to demonstrate his complete trust in her. For a brief second, Autumn froze. A flicker of hesitation crossed her beautiful face. But greed and the pressure of $300,000 in personal debt waiting outside clouded her judgment. She believed the company was thriving. She believed those liabilities were insignificant compared to the profits she expected to receive. Autumn smiled arrogantly and signed her name. I rose from my chair and fastened the button of my suit jacket. I looked at the 2 people celebrating their imaginary victory. "Congratulations," I said. "This will be an educational experience for all of us." Then I turned and walked out of the room that had been my home for 20 years. Henry and Autumn had no idea that they had just signed their own death warrant. They believed they had acquired a gold mine. They didn't know that my carefully prepared trap had officially snapped shut around them. Exactly 3 days after that signing ceremony, a shocking event erupted at the company's largest construction project, and in a state of complete panic, Henry picked up the phone and called me. Monday morning became a nightmare for Henry and Autumn. I sat in my new office at Davis Construction Solutions, calmly enjoying a cup of coffee. My phone kept buzzing with messages from former employees. Autumn began her first day in charge with arrogance. She walked into the company like an authoritarian queen. But that confidence didn't last long. At exactly 9 o'clock, the entire supply chain for the flagship East Side project came to a halt. Jake's concrete trucks never arrived. Maria's steel deliveries disappeared as well. The company's largest construction site froze completely. The machinery fell silent. Hundreds of workers stood around in confusion. Henry panicked and called Jake only to receive a cold response. Jake told him that he only worked with Paul Davis's personal guarantee. The old agreement had expired, and they had no obligation to extend credit to a new executive who had not yet earned their trust. At the same time, major investors began sending formal notices demanding a suspension of construction. They knew I had stepped down as chief engineer. They had no confidence in Henry or Autumn. They demanded proof of financial stability and technical competence. Otherwise, they would terminate their contracts and impose penalties for breach of agreement. Henry's office descended into complete chaos. Phones rang non-stop like war drums. But the most devastating blow came from another direction. Autumn's creditors had found her. The casinos knew she had suddenly become the owner of 50% of a major construction company. Aggressive collection calls started pouring directly into the company's office lines. Men with intimidating reputations began appearing in the building lobby looking for Autumn. Panic consumed her. She locked herself inside her office. The carefully applied makeup on her face could no longer hide her fear. If you've made it this far, then this story has probably stirred some emotions. Please take a quick moment to like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you've watched this far, and tell me how you think the story will end. Let's see if your prediction is correct. Many people watch without doing so, but it costs nothing and means a great deal to us. Henry stood helplessly as the company slipped into paralysis. The joint venture agreement he had been so proud of was now tightening around his own neck. Finally, he called me. His voice trembled with panic on the other end of the line. He begged me to come back and save the company. I listened in silence. Then I calmly ended the call. I opened my leather briefcase and removed another set of legal documents. I knew the moment had arrived to deliver the final blow. I pushed open the door to the conference room of the old company. The arrogance that had filled the room only a few days earlier had completely vanished. Henry sat slumped over the table. His hair was disheveled. Autumn stood by the window, her face hollow from fear and exhaustion. Outside the room, telephones continued ringing without pause. I placed a thick stack of documents on the glass table. The sharp sound made both of them look up. Henry stared at me as though he had just spotted a life raft in the middle of a storm. He immediately began pleading for me to save the company. He said the banks were demanding repayment. Suppliers had stopped delivering materials. Autumn hurried toward me as well. She tried to reclaim the sweet, charming personality she had once worn so effortlessly. She said everything was a misunderstanding. She said we were family and should face these difficulties together. I looked at her with an icy smile. Then I pushed the legal documents across the table. Take a careful look at these numbers, I said. The first document was a notice withdrawing all intellectual property licenses related to the company's project designs. Every core construction technology was registered under my personal ownership. Once I left, the old company no longer had the legal right to use them. The next documents were notices from the banks regarding the new loans Henry had signed under Autumn's encouragement. Autumn's hands trembled as she turned the pages. The color drained from her face. Then even that color disappeared. "This can't be happening," she stammered. "I own 50% of this company. I have rights to its assets." I leaned forward. My voice was hard and cold. "You own 50% of an empty shell," I said, "and 100% of your responsibilities for your debts. Welcome to reality, Autumn." She collapsed into the leather chair. The transfer agreement she had eagerly signed only days earlier had become the handcuffs locking her future into place. Under the personal liability provisions, she would now be responsible with her own assets for the company's obligations. Her $300,000 in gambling debt still existed. Now she also faced the enormous liabilities created by suspended projects and failing contracts. Henry looked at his wife. Then he looked at me. Confusion filled his eyes. He still didn't fully understand what had happened. "Why are you doing this to us?" he asked. I looked at my only son. Beneath my cold expression was a pain deeper than he could imagine. "A structure built on a rotten foundation has to be torn down before it can be rebuilt," I told him. Then I stood up and walked toward the door. I knew Autumn's true nature. I knew exactly what a predator would do when the ship began to sink. A faint smile crossed my face, and I waited for the final act of the drama that would unfold the following day. Just as I had predicted, a predator like Autumn would never remain aboard a sinking ship. The following morning, Henry's executive office was empty. Every remaining dollar in the company's emergency account had been withdrawn. Autumn had gathered all of the cash and fled during the night. She had even left behind a signed divorce petition on Henry's desk. She vanished like a ghost, leaving behind wreckage, debt, and devastation for my son. Henry collapsed completely. He had nothing left. The woman he had defended at all costs had betrayed him in the cruelest way imaginable. That afternoon, the door to my new office burst open. Henry stepped inside, looking worse than I had ever seen him. His clothes were wrinkled and disordered. His beard was unshaven. His eyes were swollen and bloodshot from crying and spending the night awake. The arrogance and superiority of the young executive were gone. Standing before me now was nothing more than a broken man trembling in the middle of a storm he had created himself. He dropped to his knees on the stone floor in front of my desk. The sound of a grown man's sobs filled the room. He grabbed my knees and repeatedly apologized. He told me he had been wrong. He admitted that he had been foolish enough to believe Autumn's sweet words. He said he had destroyed the work his mother and father had spent their lives building. He begged me to save him. He begged me to save what little honor remained in the Davis family name. The satisfaction of seeing a wrongdoer punished faded quickly. In its place came the deep ache of a father's grief. I looked down at my only son trembling at my feet. It felt as though an invisible hand were squeezing my heart. I remembered the little boy who used to run after me around construction sites, grinning from ear to ear whenever I placed an oversized hard hat on his head. I had once sworn that I would protect him for the rest of my life. But I also knew that if I surrendered too easily this time, he would never truly grow up. I sat silently and watched Henry cry for 10 full minutes. I did not help him to his feet. I let him face the humiliation and consequences of his own decisions. The emotions inside the room settled over us like a block of concrete, crushing everything beneath its weight. Eventually, Henry's sobbing began to fade. I stood up and walked toward him. Then I removed a single sheet of paper from my desk drawer. I looked directly into the eyes of my desperate son, and I offered him one final choice. It was an offer that could completely change the course of his life, or send him away from me forever. I slid the paper across the desk toward Henry. It wasn't $1 million check to rescue the old company. It was an employment contract for a junior project management position at Davis Construction Solutions. The salary was only enough to cover the most basic necessities. I told Henry that if he wanted to rebuild his life, he would have to start at the level of an apprentice. He would have to return to the job site and relearn how to mix mortar, how to lay bricks, and how to appreciate the value of hard-earned sweat. Henry looked at the paper. Then he looked at me. Tears still ran down his face, but this time I saw something different in his eyes. The resentment was gone. The arrogance was gone. What remained was humility and determination. He picked up the pen and slowly signed his name. From the ashes of everything that had happened, we began rebuilding trust. Every day, I took him to the construction sites with me. I treated him no differently than any other employee. I was strict, demanding, uncompromising. And Henry did not disappoint me. He accepted the hardship, he accepted the consequences of his mistakes, and he worked to earn back what he had lost. Relationships are not like construction projects. You cannot simply pour a new foundation and start over. Trust must be rebuilt one day at a time. Sometimes life has to tear down everything false before we can see the true core of who we are. The greatest revenge is not destroying another person. It is helping the people we love find their way back to themselves. Thank you for joining me on Dad's Real Life Revenge. Don't forget to share your own story in the comments and subscribe so you won't miss the next hard-earned lesson. I'll see you in the next video. I looked across the job site at Henry as he carefully reviewed a set of blueprints beneath the afternoon sun. His face had grown darker from months of wind and sunlight, but the peace had returned to his smile. Our new project was taking shape. This time its foundation was built on integrity, honest work, and the unconditional love of a father. And a foundation built on those things will never collapse, no matter how fierce the storms of life become.